I'm Claire Whitman, 29 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my parents' world revolved around my younger brother Jason. I learned to keep my head down and move forward on my own, but nothing prepared me for the afternoon I walked into the law office for my grandfather's will. My father leaned forward in his chair, my mother folded her hands like she was praying, and Jason sat quietly, the picture of expectation. I felt the weight of their eyes before the lawyer had even spoken. That day, I thought I would hear my name, only to have it erased, but something happened in that room that shifted the ground beneath us. And it all began with a silence I could no longer endure. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever felt overshadowed in your own family. I was born into a household that valued appearances over fairness. My father Richard worked long hours at a manufacturing firm, and my mother Linda spent her time organizing neighborhood events and making sure Jason was always the center of attention. From the outside, we looked like a polished, respectable family. Inside, the air was heavy with imbalance. By the time I was old enough to notice the difference was already clear, Jason received applause for every stumble and smile while my achievements disappeared into silence. I remember my 10th birthday vividly. My mother baked me a small cake at home, and my parents sang quickly before reminding me not to make a mess. That same year, Jason turned 7 and was treated to a backyard carnival with pony rides and a magician the whole neighborhood invited. Standing in the kitchen window, I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that maybe I was just more serious than he was, but the truth lodged deep inside me. They didn't look at me the way they looked at him, and I couldn't pretend not to notice. School gave me another chance to prove myself, and I worked harder than anyone I knew. Straight A's lined my report cards, ribbons filled a drawer in my room, and my teachers praised my dedication. At home, my parents would simply nod and say, "We expected that from you, Claire." Meanwhile, when Jason came home with average grades, we'd celebrate with pizza nights and endless praise. I pushed myself further, joining every club I could, from debate to science fair to the school newspaper, but no matter how much I did, I could never outshine their golden boy. By the time I entered college, I was used to managing on my own. I earned scholarships, picked up freelance design work, and scraped together enough to cover what my family wouldn't. When I called home with news of a promotion at my part-time job, my father barely listened before asking if I'd heard Jason had made the varsity team. It became clear that no matter how high I climbed, I would never reach their definition of worthy. They had already decided who carried the family's light, and it wasn't me. Through all of it, I learned to hide the ache behind a steady exterior. I told myself independence was strength, that being overlooked meant I could prove myself in ways Jason never had to. Still late at night, I would wonder what it would feel like to have them cheer for me to be the one whose picture they proudly showed off instead of tucked away. Those thoughts stayed with me even as I graduated, debt-free, landed a solid career, and eventually bought a modest condo on my own. I walked into adulthood with every reason to feel accomplished, but the hollow space inside me never left. It wasn't just about money or recognition. It was about finally being seen as more than the daughter who didn't need anything. And on the day I sat down for my grandfather's will reading, I carried that hollow space with me, bracing myself for one final dismissal. What I didn't know then was that the silence I had endured all my life was about to be broken, and not by me. Growing up in the Whitman house meant living in 2 different worlds under the same roof. For Jason, everything was bright, full of reward and celebration. For me, it was muted quiet and filled with expectations I was never allowed to fall short of. When I was 10 years old, my parents gave me a simple homemade cake with 10 candles and a brief chorus of happy birthday before moving on with their evening. That same year, Jason turned 7, and our backyard turned into a carnival. There were pony rides and magician balloons tied to every chair, and half the neighborhood in attendance. I remember leaning against the window that day, watching children laugh and run through the yard, and wondering why the kind of joy that filled Jason's birthday never seemed meant for me. School only made the difference sharper. I brought home report cards covered in straight A's papers with teachers' notes praising my work and medals from competitions. My father would glance at them and nod. We expected nothing less, he'd say, as if my efforts were simply routine. When Jason came home with average marks, my parents would order pizza and post about his hard work for all their friends to see. I learned quickly that my best achievements could never compete with the smallest of his. Still, I pushed myself harder. I joined the debate team, signed up for the science fair, and became a regular contributor to the school newspaper. I stayed up late working under the dim light of my desk lamp, determined to carve a place for myself through effort alone. My parents never asked what I was working on, never showed up at any of my events. But when Jason tried out for sports, even as a second-string player, they were there with banners and cheers. By the time I reached college, I had grown used to relying on myself. I earned scholarships, took on part-time jobs, and even picked up freelance design projects to pay for books and housing. While Jason drifted between majors, took breaks to figure himself out, and once even dropped out entirely, I balanced 2 jobs alongside a double major. I rode buses in the rain and carried groceries up 3 flights of stairs, all without complaint, because I knew there was no one waiting at home to ease the burden. I can still remember the day I called home to share good news. I had just secured an internship after months of applications and interviews. My voice was shaking with excitement as I told my parents. My mother listened politely before asking, "Did you hear Jason made the varsity basketball team?" The deflation in that moment was sharp, like a balloon popped mid-air. After that, I stopped calling with updates. It was the same pattern year after year. Jason crashed a car through carelessness, and instead of consequences, he was gifted another. When I asked for help covering the cost of textbooks one semester, my parents told me I'd figure it out because I was responsible. So I did. I stretched every dollar from my jobs and made sacrifices to stay on track. I budgeted to the cent-packed lunches and went without extras, while Jason was wired money regularly, under the excuse that he was still finding his path. Junior year, I had saved enough to move into a small off-campus apartment. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I invited my parents to visit. They never came. That same year, I was one of 2 students chosen to present at the University Design Expo. I practiced for weeks, my nerves buzzing with the chance to prove myself. When I stepped on stage and scanned the crowd, I looked for their faces. They weren't there. Instead, they had driven 6 hours to watch Jason race drones at an amateur competition. Later that night, I received a text from my mother. "Sorry we missed it, sweetheart. Jason's drone won 3rd place." Isn't that amazing? I remember staring at the words until they blurred on my phone screen. That was the moment I stopped waiting for their approval. I realized nothing I accomplished would ever outweigh the glow of their golden sun. After college, I was hired at a financial firm as a designer and worked my way up steadily. At 26, I bought a modest 1-bedroom condo, proud of what I had built on my own. I invited my parents over for a small housewarming. They walked through the rooms with little comment, finally saying, "It's nice. You've always been self-sufficient. We don't worry about you." It sounded less like pride and more like dismissal dressed as reassurance. Meanwhile, Jason still lived at home. He had begun pitching new startup ideas, each one a different venture my parents were eager to support. My father spoke of him as a visionary, someone who just needed a little investment to soar. I stood in my own home hearing those words and knew exactly where I stood in their eyes. I was the finished product set aside on a shelf while Jason was a work in progress worth pouring every resource into. The years shaped me into someone who no longer sought their applause, but the ache of being unseen never disappeared. Every promotion, every milestone, every quiet triumph was met with little more than indifference, while Jason's smallest steps were treated like giant leaps. Still beneath it all, a different strength was building, one born from silence, from independence, from the resolve to stand tall, even when no one clapped. I didn't know it yet, but all that strength would matter, because the day would come when I would walk into a room where my place in the family could no longer be ignored, a room where my parents would try one last time to erase me. And that was where the fight for my inheritance and for my voice would begin. When my grandfather Charles passed away, I kept my grief tucked inside. He had been the one steady presence in my life, the only family member who ever seemed to notice me for who I was. At the funeral, I gave a quiet eulogy, sharing how he never once forgot my birthday and always sent a card in his steady block handwriting. My mother blinked at me like she couldn't remember those gestures, and my father kept his hand on Jason's shoulder as though the day belonged only to him. I sat alone in the row behind them, the space between us feeling wider than the church aisle. 2 weeks later, I received a formal envelope from a local law office. The will was to be read the following Thursday. My name was listed along with my father's, my mother's, and Jason's. For a moment, I felt something fragile inside me stir, the hope that my grandfather had left behind more than possessions, maybe a final acknowledgement that I had mattered to him. The day before the reading, another envelope arrived. This one was smaller, addressed in my grandmother Evelyn's looping cursive. Inside was a short note. "Claire, please come to the reading. It's important. Your grandfather made sure of something. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Love, Grandma." I ran my finger over her words, the careful handwriting steady despite her age. She had always kept her distance from family disputes. But this was different. The letter carried weight, like she was preparing me for something beyond the ordinary. On Thursday morning, I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blazer and slacks. I wanted to walk into that office looking as composed as I could manage. When I arrived, my parents were already seated at the long, polished table with Jason beside them. My father's expression was sharp. My mother's soft smile almost rehearsed, and Jason gave me a small wave before looking back down at his folded hands. I nodded in return and took a seat across from them. The lawyer, a gray-haired man named Mr. Hollis, shuffled through a neat stack of papers. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice even. "We're here to review the last will and testament of Charles Whitman." The room fell silent except for the sound of him clearing his throat. He read the formal passages first, detailing the distribution of my grandfather's estate among his children. Then he moved to the section naming the grandchildren. My heart beat faster as I waited for my name. When Mr. Hollis stated that both Jason and I were to receive equal shares, I caught the flicker in my father's eyes. His jaw tightened, and almost immediately he leaned forward. "Actually," he said, "we'll be accepting Claire's portion on her behalf. She's never been concerned with these matters." The lawyer hesitated. I froze in my chair, the words hitting harder than I expected. My mother nodded along, smiling as though it was the most natural solution. Jason stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the table. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, my grandmother stood. "Let's hear the rest first," she said, her voice calm but firm. The room stilled. Even my father leaned back, his hand drumming impatiently on the table. Mr. Hollis cleared his throat and continued reading. He confirmed again that I, Claire Whitman, was to receive an equal portion of the inheritance. My father immediately cut in. "Let's be reasonable," he said, glancing at Mr. Hollis before sweeping his eyes across the room. "Claire has a career, a condo, no debts. Jason is still building. He has a startup in development. The money would be better used where it can grow." His voice carried the tone of someone stating a fact, not an opinion. My mother leaned forward, adding her gentle tone. "Claire has always been generous. She's never cared much about material things. I'm sure she wouldn't mind letting her brother use the money for something meaningful. He's the dreamer of the family. Meaningful. The word hung in the air. Jason hadn't held a steady job in years. I tightened my hands in my lap, forcing myself to keep breathing. When I finally spoke, my voice was even. I don't need anyone to accept anything on my behalf. My father turned to me, his expression cracking just enough to reveal his frustration. This isn't about you, Claire. It's about family, about doing what's right. My mother nodded quickly. Don't let pride cloud your judgment. I met their eyes and shook my head. I'm not giving up what Grandpa left me. Jason shifted in his chair but didn't speak. His silence felt heavier than their words. Mr. Hollis cleared his throat again. Legally, unless Claire signs a waiver or power of attorney, the inheritance belongs to her. My father's face darkened. We'll see about that. He leaned back, then began reciting every expense they had ever covered for me. We paid for your braces, your roof during college, even bought you books one semester. Don't forget what we've done for you. My mother reached for my hand across the table. If you loved us, you would do what's right for the family. For a moment, my throat closed. I couldn't find words, but then I felt another hand slip gently over mine. It was my grandmother. Her voice was quiet, steady. You don't owe them anything, Claire, and your grandfather knew it. The room felt different after she spoke. My father scowled. My mother's face stiffened, and Jason looked down at his shoes. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about money. It was about refusing to disappear once again. My father's voice grew louder as he leaned towards me as though sheer volume could bend the truth to his side. We raised you, Claire. We gave you everything you needed. You owe us. He ticked off a list of expenses like tally marks on a ledger, braces a roof during college, one semester of books. Every ordinary act of parenting was now twisted into proof of a debt I had never agreed to carry. My mother's hand slid across the table, her tone softer but no less insistent. If you loved us, you would do what's right for the family. She looked at me the way she always had, with expectation instead of affection waiting for me to give in. I felt the words pressing down, trying to fold me back into the silence I had lived with for so long. My throat tightened, but before I could respond, my grandmother's hand rested gently on mine. Evelyn's eyes met mine, steady and unwavering. You don't owe them anything, she whispered, her voice carrying through the stillness of the room. And your grandfather knew it. For a moment, no one spoke. My father's jaw clenched. My mother's smile stiffened, and Jason stared down at his shoes, saying nothing. I drew in a breath, finding strength in the calm weight of my grandmother's hand. I'm not signing anything over, I said quietly but firmly. What Grandpa left me is mine. Mr. Hollis cleared his throat, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. To be clear, unless Claire provides written consent, the inheritance cannot be transferred. That is the law. His tone was neutral, but the words cut through the tension like a blade. My father leaned back in his chair, the silence around him charged. We'll see about that, he muttered, though even he seemed to recognize that the ground beneath him was slipping. My mother withdrew her hand, folding it tightly in her lap. Jason remained still, his silence echoing louder than any argument. The reading moved on, but I barely heard the words. My pulse was loud in my ears, my grandmother's whisper repeating itself in my mind. For the first time in my life, I hadn't bowed my head or swallowed my voice. I had claimed something that was mine. When the session ended, my parents stood abruptly. My father didn't look at me, his shoulders rigid with anger. My mother offered a thin, disappointed smile, as if I had broken some unspoken rule. Jason followed them out without a word, his gaze fixed on the floor. I stayed seated, my hand still resting where my grandmother's had been moments before, the imprint of her support lingering like warmth against the cold. That evening, the messages began. My mother's text arrived first. "You embarrassed us in front of the family. Was it worth it?" A few minutes later, my father's came. "Enjoy your blood money. I hope it keeps you warm." And finally, Jason's message. I didn't ask for any of this. I stared at the last one for a long time. It was the only message that stung. I set my phone face down on the table and walked away. The silence in my apartment heavy and unyielding. That night I didn't sleep. I paced from room to room, the old part of me still wanting to send an apology, to ask them not to hate me. But another part, the part that had spoken at the table, knew better. By the third day, I needed space. Real space. I requested time off work and packed a bag. My car carried me out of the city, down roads I hadn't driven in years, until I reached the lake where my grandparents had kept a small cabin. The front door creaked when I pushed it open, as though it remembered me. Dust coated the furniture, and the air smelled of wood and old stone. I built a fire, wrapped myself in a blanket, and let the tears come silent, overdue grief. Grief not only for my grandfather, but for every year I had spent waiting for scraps of love. Morning light filtered through the curtains when I rose the next day. In the guest bedroom, while pulling open a drawer, I found a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my grandfather's neat, blocky handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. "Claire." It began. "If you're reading this, the will has already been read. I imagine your parents are making things difficult. I want you to know I saw it all. The way they overlooked you. The way they handed Jason everything and told you to be strong. You were never invisible to me. This inheritance is not a gift. It is recognition. You earned it every day you kept going, even when no one applauded. Your voice matters, Claire. Don't let anyone take it from you again. Love always, Grandpa." I sat down on the floor, the letter pressed to my chest. It wasn't about the money, it never had been. It was about being seen finally and undeniably. The ache I had carried for years shifted into something clearer, something stronger. When I returned to the city, the letter burned like a secret weight in my pocket, not a weapon but a shield. I called my grandmother that night. She answered on the first ring as though she had been waiting. "Did you find the letter?" she asked. "Yes," I whispered. "Thank you." Her voice softened. "Your grandfather wanted you to know that love can be quiet, but it should never be invisible. He saw you, Claire. Always." Her words filled the silence that had followed me for so long. But then she told me something else, something that made my breath catch. My parents had tried to pressure my grandfather months before he died, pushing him to change the will and cut me out entirely. Not only had he refused, but he had also worked with his lawyer and my grandmother to add a clause that protected me. Any attempt to manipulate or redirect the inheritance would strip the guilty party of their own claim. My grandmother's voice was steady as she spoke. "They crossed a line, Claire, and now they've triggered the clause. They can't undo it." I sat down hard, the letter still in my lap. For the first time, I realized my grandfather had done more than love me quietly. He had planned for this moment, planned to ensure I couldn't be erased. After my call with Grandma, I sat in silence, the truth she had shared circling in my mind. My parents had tried to pressure my grandfather into cutting me out, and instead he had turned their scheming against them. The clause he had added was clear. Anyone who tried to tamper with his wishes would lose their own claim. My parents had triggered it the moment they attempted to shift my portion to Jason. For years I had thought I was standing alone, unseen and unheard. Now I realized my grandfather had been protecting me all along, even after he was gone. That night the knock at my door startled me. When I opened it, my parents stood in the hallway. My mother's eyes were red mascara smudged beneath them. My father's face was flushed with anger, his jaw tight. He pushed past me without asking, pacing across my living room like he owned the space. My mother lingered at the doorway before stepping inside, wringing her hands. "You had this planned all along," my father snapped. His voice carried the sharp edge I remembered from childhood, the tone he used when no answer would satisfy him. "You manipulated your grandmother. You poisoned your grandfather against us." I closed the door and faced him. "Grandpa made his choices. You made yours." My mother's voice cracked as she stepped forward. "Claire, please, don't do this. Just sign it over. Jason needs this more than you do." Her tone was pleading, but her words were the same ones she had repeated my whole life. Jason needed, and I could go without. I shook my head. I needed a family for 29 years. I never had one. The words stopped them both. For a moment, neither spoke. Then my father let out a bitter laugh. "Fine. If that's how you feel, I hope the money keeps you warm, because after this you don't have a family anymore." They left together, the door slamming behind them. I stood in the quiet that followed, waiting for tears that didn't come. Instead, I felt something different. I hadn't lost a family that night. I had lost people who had never truly stood beside me. For the first time, I didn't feel like the one abandoned. I felt free. The days that followed were filled with silence. No angry texts, no late-night calls, not even a half-hearted attempt to smooth things over. It was as if my parents had erased me altogether, deciding that without obedience, I no longer existed. At first, the emptiness felt strange, but soon I noticed what filled it: calls from grandma check-ins, from friends, reminders that I wasn't as alone as I had once believed. One afternoon, just as I was about to leave for groceries, another knock came at my door. I froze, expecting my parents again, but when I looked through the peephole, it was Jason. He stood with his hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie, shifting from one foot to the other like he wasn't sure if he belonged there. When I opened the door, he looked up quickly. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside. He walked in but didn't sit. Instead, he lingered in the middle of my living room, his eyes drifting across the shelves, the framed photos, the signs of the life I had built without him. "I didn't know they were going to do that," he said finally, his voice quiet. "At the will reading, I didn't ask for it." I folded my arms. "But you didn't stop them either." He flinched at the words, nodding slowly. "I know, and I should have." The silence between us stretched until he pulled something from his jacket pocket. A folded envelope, the same familiar block handwriting across the front. "Grandma gave this to me after everything blew up. It's from Grandpa." He handed it to me, but I shook my head. "It's yours. You read it." Jason unfolded the paper, his hands unsteady. He didn't write the same way to me, he admitted. His eyes moved across the lines as he spoke. He said he saw what Mom and Dad had done, how they tried to shape me into their legacy. He said it ruined my chance to become my own person. He told me to stop letting other people fight my battles, to grow up, to apologize, to fix what I can. Jason looked up at me, his eyes tired. "I'm sorry, Claire. Not just for the inheritance, for everything. For not speaking up. For letting them push you aside while I coasted. I knew it deep down, but it was easier to ignore than to face them." The apology hung in the air, heavier than I expected. For years I had imagined what it would sound like, and now that it had come, it didn't erase the past, but it cracked something open. We sat down talking for hours about the things we had never said, the birthdays that had passed, with lopsided celebrations, the science fairs and showcases my parents had ignored, the way Jason had always been told he was special, while I was told I was strong enough to go without. He confessed what I hadn't realized, being the favorite had been its own kind of prison. Every time I failed, they covered for me, he said, his voice low. They paid it off, fixed it, made excuses. I never learned how to stand on my own. I'm 26 years old, and I've never earned anything. You built your life brick by brick. I envy that. We fell quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't demand filling. Then Jason spoke again, his words surprising me. I'm going back to school, with my share of the inheritance, community college first, then maybe transfer. I want to study software design, maybe finance later. I want to build something of my own. I looked at him, searching for hesitation, but there was none. He wasn't making another hollow promise. He was setting a course. I felt a small smile rise, not from obligation, but from something real. I think Grandpa would be proud, I said. Jason nodded. I know he would. For the first time since we were children, we hugged. Not because it was expected, but because it felt right. 6 months had passed since the day my parents stormed out of my apartment, their words echoing behind them like a slammed door. In all that time, I hadn't heard from either of them. No phone calls, no texts, no strained attempts to patch things together. For once, the silence wasn't mine to carry, it was theirs. Jason and I spoke often during those months. Sometimes it was short calls, other times long conversations that stretched into the night. He sent me photos of his class projects and updates about exams, proof that he was serious about building something of his own. I teased him now and then, calling him the family nerd, and he always laughed. There was an ease between us that had never existed before, a rhythm that felt new but steady. Meanwhile, Grandma became our anchor. She called almost every day sometimes, just to say she loved us, other times to remind us that we were rewriting what family meant. Her words stayed with me, steadying me when doubt crept in. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere, even if it wasn't in the home I had grown up in. But the fallout with my parents lingered in the background, impossible to ignore. Grandma told me more than once that Richard and Linda were furious about the will, furious about losing not just their chance to redirect my share, but part of their own. The clause Grandpa had added was airtight, and no matter how many times they argued with the lawyer, the answer never changed. They had overstepped, and the consequence was theirs to bear. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Jason. He had driven over after class, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the way he used to come home from high school. We shared takeout cartons between us, the kind of simple meal that didn't need ceremony. They cut me off completely, he said, after a long pause, pushing his noodles around with a fork. No calls, no money, nothing. They said, if I stay on your side, I'm on my own. I watched him, the weight of his words settling over us. How do you feel about that? He shrugged, but his eyes were tired. It hurts, I won't lie, but at the same time I feel lighter, like I can finally breathe without waiting for their approval. I nodded, recognizing the same freedom I had felt months earlier. They can't control you anymore. He gave me a small smile. I guess neither of us ever really belonged in their version of family. Maybe this is better. That night after Jason left, I pulled out Grandpa's letter again. The pages were soft now from how often I had unfolded them, but the words hadn't lost their power. You were never invisible to me. Your voice matters. Don't let anyone take it from you again. Reading those lines, I thought about how different things felt now. For years, I had worked to be seen, to earn even a sliver of recognition. Now I was choosing to see myself, and that choice was stronger than their silence. In the weeks that followed, I started putting my inheritance to use. Not on myself, not on the kind of things my parents might have called indulgent. I set up a small mentorship fund for young women in fields where voices like mine were often pushed aside. I named it after my grandfather, a quiet tribute to the man who had made sure I would not disappear. Each time I met with one of the girls, heard their stories, and saw their determination, I thought of him. Therapy became part of my routine again, too. I sat in the same chair each week, peeling back layers of shame I had carried for decades. Learning to separate who I was from who I had been told to be was messy work but necessary. Some days I left lighter, other days heavier, but always moving forward. Jason kept showing up not just for me, but for himself. He shared his grades, his projects, his small victories. We began a tradition, sibling Sundays once a month, no phones, no outside distractions. Sometimes we cooked pancakes, sometimes we walked by the lake, sometimes we just sat on the couch and talked. For the first time, we were building something real between us, something that belonged only to us. Through it all, Grandma remained steady. She visited often, bringing her gentle presence into my home. "You two are rewriting the story," she told us one Sunday afternoon as she sat at my kitchen table sipping tea. "Don't stop now." Her words reminded me that this wasn't just about money or inheritance or even the years of being overlooked. It was about claiming space where we had once been erased, about choosing a new kind of family when the old one refused to be whole. Looking back, I realized my parents' threats had not destroyed me. They had freed me. In losing them, I had gained the chance to build something better with Jason, with Grandma, with the people who stood beside me by choice, not obligation. And though I didn't know what the future would hold, I knew this much: my voice was no longer buried. I had inherited more than money. I had inherited the right to be heard, and I intended to use it. By the time spring arrived, I had stopped waiting for my parents to come back around. Their silence had stretched too long to be accidental. It was clear they meant for me and Jason to be cut away like branches they no longer wanted on their tree. For once, I wasn't chasing them, and neither was Jason. Instead, we kept building the pieces of our new lives day by day on our own terms. Jason's classes were going well. He'd bring his laptop to my place on Sundays and show me the projects he was working on. I could see the pride in his face when he scrolled through his code or explained a concept he had finally mastered. He was still getting used to the work ethic it demanded, but he wasn't quitting. That mattered more than anything. One afternoon, after a long session of him walking me through a design project, we sat at the kitchen table with mugs of coffee. "They've stopped calling completely," he said quietly. "Not even a text on my birthday." I watched him stare into his cup, his shoulders slumping just slightly. "How does that feel?" I asked. He shrugged, though his eyes gave away more than his voice. "It hurts, but I think I'd rather feel that than keep living the way I was. At least this feels honest." We sat in silence for a while before I reached across the table and touched his hand. "You're doing the hard part now. You're building something of your own. That's more than they ever taught either of us." He nodded, his grip tightening just slightly before letting go. "I don't want to be who I was anymore." In those words, I heard the shift that Grandpa must have hoped for. Jason wasn't the boy who coasted on other people's efforts. He was finally learning what it meant to stand. Meanwhile, I kept moving forward with the mentorship fund. Applications came in from young women across the state, students who reminded me of myself working late nights, holding down jobs, pushing forward without anyone clapping for them. Meeting them, hearing their stories, felt like carrying Grandpa's legacy into something bigger than either of us could have done alone. Grandma visited often. She'd sit in my living room with a blanket over her lap, listening while Jason and I shared updates. "You two are proving that family is more than names on paper," she told us one evening. "It's what you choose to build with each other." Her presence grounded us both. She had spent decades watching the imbalance in our family, and now she was watching the reversal unfold. The strength in her quiet words reminded me how much of this journey wasn't only mine, it was hers too. Still, I couldn't ignore the undercurrent of anger that remained with my parents. Word reached us through distant relatives that Richard and Linda were still fuming about the clause in the will, still blaming me for what they had lost. I learned they had told neighbors that I had manipulated my way into taking everything from them. It hurt to know their story about me was still one of betrayal, but I also knew it wasn't the truth. For once, the truth was finally in my hands, and no one could strip it away. Jason struggled with that more than I did. One evening, after we cooked dinner together, he admitted, "They told me I was their pride for so long. Now they act like I don't exist. It's like all of it was conditional." I looked at him, seeing the weight in his expression. "Then maybe it's better this way. At least now you know what was real and what wasn't." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I do." The weeks passed, and little by little the space my parents left behind didn't feel like a loss anymore. It felt like an opening. I poured myself into my work, into the fund, into therapy, and into the quiet routines Jason and I had built. He kept pushing forward with his classes, slowly building the kind of independence he had never known before. One Sunday, as we sat on my couch watching the sunset through the window, Jason leaned back and said, "You know, for the first time in my life, I don't feel like I'm competing with anyone. Not with you, not with them. Just with myself." I smiled at him, the warmth of his words sinking in. That's how it should be. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. For the first time in years, the silence between us felt like peace, not absence. But even in that peace, I knew the story wasn't finished. My parents' absence wasn't the end. It was just another chapter. The real test would be whether Jason and I could keep choosing this path, keep holding on to the truth we had fought so hard to reach. The months after Jason's words about finally standing on his own became the quiet turning point of our lives. We stopped looking back at what we had lost and began building what we had been denied for so long. Our Sundays became a steady rhythm, pancakes one week a walk by the lake, another, sometimes just the two of us talking until the light outside faded. They were simple moments, but they carried the kind of peace that had never existed in our family before. Grandma often joined us, her presence a constant reminder of the love that had been steady even in silence. She told us we were rewriting the story, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that would come after. Her words settled deep in me, because for the first time, I felt like I was part of a family that wasn't built on comparison or favoritism, but on choice and respect. With the inheritance, I kept expanding the mentorship fund. Watching young women step into opportunities they might have otherwise been denied gave me a sense of purpose that money alone could never provide. Every time I saw their excitement, I thought of Grandpa. His belief in me had outlived him, and through that, it was still shaping lives. Jason found his footing too. He stayed in school, committed to his classes, and slowly started building confidence in a way I had never seen from him before. The weight of being the golden son had finally lifted, and without it, he was discovering who he really wanted to be. My parents never reached out again. Their silence remained absolute, and though a part of me used to ache for it, I learned to see it differently. It wasn't rejection anymore. It was release. I no longer carried the burden of trying to earn what they had never given freely. Instead, I carried the voice my grandfather told me to protect, and the bond I had built with Jason and Grandma. Looking back now, I see that justice didn't arrive as a dramatic moment or a single victory. It came in layers through the will my grandfather left behind, the support of my grandmother, and the choices Jason and I made to step out of the shadows we had been placed in. Justice looked like standing firm in the face of erasure and choosing not to disappear. What I learned through it all is simple but true. Family isn't measured by who shares your blood, but by who shows up, who listens, and who sees you for who you are. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about reclaiming your place, your dignity, and your voice. So that's the story of how I stopped being invisible in my own family and started living on my own terms. If you've ever had to fight to be heard, I hope my story reminds you that your voice matters too. Thank you for listening. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like mine, don't forget to subscribe.